Say it for the recording. Shambhala 101, episode 7. What will happen next? Gets exciting. I'm trying to start, you've noticed this, I'm sure, but I'm trying to start every one of these with just to touch back on meditation, because it is easy to slip into the juicy story of meditation and the bells and the whistles and use that as a substitute for actually practicing. But actually practicing is what matters. And the rest, as we said, we've been saying, the rest is kind of it's the glass in which the water is poured. So, today I was going to say, just start by saying that one of the words for meditation in Tibetan is gom. And gom means becoming familiar. And this isn't exclusive to Tibetan. It's also explained this way in traditional Buddhism. But these square cushions that we have here are called gomdens. So they're places. You're sitting on a place to become familiar with, or meditation cushion. And so when we say familiar, familiar with what is the question. And kind of two things which are two sides of the same coin. Familiar with the way our attention kind of opens and closes, or is kind of scattered. I was remembering somebody who used to come here years ago who had this analogy I thought was great. He said, this was in the time when WBHM played classical music during the day. That's how long ago it was. And he said, I hear them announcing something is coming up next. And I think, oh, I really like that piece of music. And the next thing I know, it's over. And how often that happens, where we're getting ready to focus on something and then it's gone. And we don't have that consciousness of what happened. Or in conversation or looking at scenery, so somebody's talking to you and they're saying something really important and then you realize you didn't hear it. At least this happens to me. And then I try to pick up on the context to try to get what it was that person just said to me. So familiar with how our attention flashes on and off. And then on the flip side, familiar with our thought loops, which, as you know, as you begin to be aware of them, they repeat and repeat and repeat, right? It's like we go into the same thought chain. And we know which thought chain gets the adrenaline going, I guess, or the endorphins going, which thoughts seem addictive, even if they're not pleasurable, can kind of repeat and repeat. So what we're doing in meditation, it's not like we're consciously changing those, but we're just opening our awareness to see, oh, I lost my awareness. Oh, now I'm back. Oh, that loop is kicking off again. The opposite of doing that is also what we do, which is kind of suppressing our familiarity. Like, I don't want to know what I'm thinking, so let me turn on something to distract me. I don't want to know this. I'm going to tell this story and get lost in the story of what so-and-so did to such and such, so that maybe you're not doing it consciously, but subconsciously, we don't have to attend to things that aren't as comfortable or predictable, right? And why would we go to all this trouble to become familiar with our thought loops and our attention span? because that's what's really happening. And when we can know what's really happening and pay attention outside of our little thought hole to what's happening around us, we can act in the world better. We can stop making ourselves miserable and learn how to make ourselves happy. We can care about other people. We can get things done that we want to get done. And we can take care of what we really need to care about. So we, in meditation, just very disciplined but not being hard on ourselves. We give ourselves space and say, all right, I'm just going to notice what's happening. And resist the temptation to block it off, but just notice it. And through that process, just naturally begin to settle down, open our awareness, be present more, be conscious, just because you do, because we have the capacity to do that. So I started with that, and then I thought, well, this is a really good lead-in to what I wanted to talk about today, which is actually kind of what happened in Tibet in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which contributed to the demise of Tibet in the 1950s. Because you'll see, I think what happened there is they tried really hard to block out what was happening around them in the world, and it didn't work. Traditionally in Tibetan Buddhism, Shambhala, or the kingdom of Shambhala, is the name for a society that supports human beings being awake, having wisdom, having compassion, and kindness. You may have heard of Pure Land Buddhism. Anybody heard of that? It's this whole kind of strain of Buddhism that has to do with there's a pure land somewhere, and if you have a really good life in this life, when you die, you'll have a chance to be reborn in that pure land. And so you could spend a lot of time visualizing and supplicating that pure land, which is, it's like Sukhavati is a pure land of Amitabha. And it's not a realm for humans. It's this other kind of rebirth that you take, I guess, in Sukhavati. So Shambhala, one way to think about it is, it's a pure land for humans. It's another realm in which, it is a realm in which the conditions are such that it's easier to practice meditation, to be kind, to be caring, and therefore to become what we say enlightened. And in our community, we use the image of Shambhala, of a pure land, to remind ourselves that we actually can have an environment that could support human beings in realizing their best potential. And the inspiration for the founding teacher of Shambhala, Chogyam Trungpa, the Tibetan meditation teacher, was that as this world gets more and more difficult and challenging, which is called the Dark Age, that having meditation practice, learning how to be brave and how to be kind is going to be helpful. And kind of vice versa, building a society in which people can be brave, kind, and insightful is going to be helpful for the world. So Chogyam Trungpa was born in Tibet, in eastern Tibet, in 1940. And in the way that's was very traditional in Tibet, when he was a baby, he was recognized as the 11th rebirth of a line of meditation adepts called the Trungpas. It wasn't the most high status of the lines. It's like one of the lesser lines in the Kagyu tradition. But he was recognized. They came like they did. I'm sure you've seen movies and things where they come and they take the baby and they bring him to the monastery, and then he gets raised to be a guru, right? So he gets all this teaching and training and taught how to do ceremonies and things like that. His mother came with him. There's an autobiography, which I'll bring next week to show you, where he tells this whole story. And you could tell as a little kid, he really wished this wasn't happening to him because he really wanted to play with the other kids and mess around with the horses and have his real name instead of this fancy title. But his mother said, no, they recognize you, you have to do this. He was raised in a monastery called Shambhala, which eventually he was supposed to become the abbot of, and did. He was educated in the Rimé tradition in Tibet, which I talked about last week, I think, which was sort of a reformation, a spiritual reformation that happened starting in the 1880s to the 1910s in Tibet, that brought together several of the different schools where they began to study and learn from each other and combine their philosophies and also integrate some of the indigenous culture, the warrior culture, the local medicine, which is very much related to Chinese medicine and energy practices and things like that. And they talk about it as the golden age. They had books, they had colleges, and they had publishing setups where they started publishing books and did all this translation and all of this very wonderful, moving stuff. Buddhicized some of the traditionals. Like they have a very famous, now we have the Odyssey out in movie theaters, so Homer. So Tibet has this very famous epic poem called Gesarvling that's uncounted. It's an oral tradition, so there's just many stories of it. And it had always been oral, but in this time they actually wrote it down or tried to write some of it down. So that, it was that very fertile time. And it was very inspiring to that intellectual community and the scientists and physicians and the monastics and the monasteries. But you're talking about the 1910s, right? What's happening around Tibet? Well, the Chinese empire falls, right? The emperors are no more, they're dethroned, and a republic happens in China. The czars in Russia are dethroned, and the Bolsheviks have a revolution, and then they begin to spread the Soviet Union all across Asia. And meanwhile, the British are in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, but not in Nepal, I learned. They decided they didn't have to conquer Nepal because Nepal was friendly enough to them. They could just leave it there. And the British were wanting to trade with the Tibetans. And the Chinese were wanting to invade and capture China, and the Russians wouldn't mind having Tibet either, since they have all of that. So they're all looking at Tibet. Tibet has no central secular government. It's what we would call feudal, like in the European tradition of feudal. It has these various kings of the various little lands, and each of them has a monastery that they pay tribute to, and then they use the spiritual what do you call it? Spiritual power, I guess, for their own power reasons. And the nominal leader, I guess, of Tibet, if you could say that, is the head of the Gelugpa lineage, who's the Dalai Lama. So basically, I mean, from our point of view, it's a theocracy, right? Like, who's in charge, who makes the decisions? It's all of these monastics and the teachers and that whole spiritual level. The people of Tibet, I mean, this is like the 1910s and 1920s. They have no education system, have no healthcare system. Girls don't get educated, only boys who go to monasteries get educated. So it's feudal in that way too. It's not like the other countries have changed around them. The little principalities are run by kings. They inherit, they pass their titles on through their family lineage. So there were people within Tibet who thought, hey, there's things happening outside our borders. We need to know what's going on. Particularly, it seems like in the part of Tibet that borders India, those people really want to do trading with the British. And the British want to do trading with them and just establish those kind of trade routes and facilities and agreements. I know Russia was really wanting to expand its empire there. But the spiritual, the monastics, the people running the monasteries, did not want to have relationships with these other countries. They thought if they began to relate to countries around them, that, I mean, if you put it in idealistic terms, that the spiritual purity of their tradition would be compromised. If you put it in cynical, secular terms, you would say that they would lose their power position and their access, their control of resources. There was, I read that in 1924, I think, Mongolia, which is just north of Tibet, became part of the Greater Russian Empire and adopted communism, had a secular government. And they say that the Buddhist Lama, who had been the head of the monastic situation in Mongolia, passed away and was not reborn, where they couldn't find his rebirth. So all the Tibetan spiritualists say, okay, that's not going to happen. To us, so Tibet, to the disappointment of the countries around them, was very insular. But meantime, I mean, Trungpa is born in 1940 and he's brought up as a young boy and he gets very good teaching and tutoring from the teachers who were like the second generation down from these Rime masters. And their idea is they're going to take his monastery and make, he calls it a seminary, but kind of a college. And monastics from all over could come and they could study together and they would be, they wouldn't lose that tradition of being able to learn from each other and learn from all of these different schools. So in 1948, after World War II, there's a communist revolution in China, right? And Mao Zedong and the communists took over the Chinese government. And they began to really vigorously and violently expand the empire into Tibet. At one time, I mean, back and forth, Tibet had been part of China. And the Chinese, I think, still thought that it was. The Tibetans had this idea that it wasn't. And we were, but we're not now, because now there's no emperor, so we're not loyal to that emperor. In the Chinese view, they were going to liberate the proletariat of Tibet, right? And they were going to bring the modern era to the peasants of Tibet. okay, that's the pure, that's the idealistic view, and then I'm sure the much more cynical view is they were just gonna grab those resources. And in his autobiography, Trungpa Rinpoche talks about how they kept, it's like the monasteries kept on trying to do what they were doing, you know, hold to their tradition and educate people, educate the monastics and hold on to just the tremendous spiritual depth that they had. But it got harder and harder because it was hard to travel. And so you couldn't, he says, it's like in the previous generation, if you wanted to go study with this famous person that you heard of, that was a couple of 100 miles away, you went. And then it became much harder to do that. Also, they began to get, this is in the early 50s, people who had lived in Eastern Tibet, ordinary people, started fleeing the Chinese army. And so there were refugees all through that area. So I was gonna have more time than I thought, so there's a very poignant and meaningful part in his autobiography. Trungpa talks about when he was about 15 years old, and he had a very beloved teacher named Khenpo Gangshar, who was he was a Khenpo from his other teacher, Jamgon Kongtrul's monastery. And he was at Surmang. He seems to be somebody who was really noticing what was happening, while the others were just trying to figure out, you know, how to survive and how to get through it. And maybe the Chinese would change their minds and go away. But it was at this point, Trungpa says that Khenpo Gangshar said, we can no longer keep the spiritual tradition that we've been holding on to as exclusively for monastics. But it's time to start teaching everybody, all the lay people, how to meditate and what meditation does, and the basic spiritual traditions of Buddhism. And he was very clear about that. It was out of the tradition, and he got a lot of pushback on it. But it was just this. It made a big impression on Trungpa Rinpoche that somebody he respected so much had really kind of was willing to make a big leap and do something really different because of what was happening in Tibet. So we have a teacher in our community now, John Rockwell, who cites this teacher, Khenpo Gangshar, a lot, and he says, we're like at that time, and that we can't, if we're going to pursue a spiritual path, it has to be something that's available to everybody and not just kept exclusively to people with the time and the money to do the deep study. I don't know if he's right or what that involves, but it is really, I thought, really interesting to pay attention to that. I was just thinking, I was in a conversation this week with somebody he says we shouldn't, how do you tell the difference between when you're actually making the spiritual traditions available to everybody because everybody should have access, and when you're going the popular route and kind of I want to say dumbing down, but watering down what's in a spiritual tradition in order to make it palatable for people. And I think that is a kind of interesting point to contemplate. And actually, I think we in 2026 are the people that can really think about those kind of things. We still have access to the deep tradition, but we're out here in the world seeing what's happening. And so what does that look like, I guess, is the question. And I'll talk more about this, what happens next in the saga, because at the other end of the saga is us, actually. You know, we have this going on in Tibet in 1950, and then we have Tibetan Buddhism coming to Europe and North America in the 60s and 70s, and so what is that? What does that arc look like? Is important for us to understand, I think. But the point I wanted to make today is about, I think this point about having meditation be something that helps us actually deal with reality and know the difference between when we're hiding from what's happening and when we're actually present. That happens for us as individuals, and it also happens, you notice, in societies. When do societies, speaking of climate change, when do societies actually grapple with what's happening in the world, and when do they make a story about it's not happening? So, thank you. I hope that made sense. Now we have time, now we have half an hour or an hour, depending, to grapple with reality. So what we'll do is take a little stretch and I will light the shrine. We'll do some meditation practice. And then when we do walking meditation, at the end of walking meditation, if anybody'd like to continue the conversation in the back, we're happy to do that. If you'd like to stay and meditate some more, happy to do that.